Paul Eckloff is a former U.S. Secret Service special agent. He served on the security detail for Presidents George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump during his career, and he joins me now. Can't think of anyone better to speak to at this moment. You point out that Iran and other adversaries devote enormous resources to understanding how the Secret Service, how you at one time protected your presidents. You argue the public didn't need to know everything that Elena Treen just spelled out for us. Do you believe this puts any president, including this president, in more danger now that we know that these kinds of things happen, that these decoys are put into place at times?
It's an interesting question, and the simple answer is yes. I would assume the public knows that the Secret Service uses surreptitious or clandestine means to protect the president, and he's not always in the car or aircraft that you think he is. That's a simple tradecraft method. The public has a right to know of the level of threat, and that this volatile environment that we find ourselves in throughout the world is incredibly heightened. However, I don't believe that there is an interest beyond curiosity to knowing the means and methods that the Secret Service uses to keep the president safe. And there's a bigger issue, a security question that we're missing here.
So I do want to get back to the nature of the threat, though. Given your experience, how much of a dangerous situation was this, given the lengths that they went to make sure that he was safe? And what do you believe is the nature of that threat, especially as we continue to parse exactly what Iran is doing, its capabilities, and how strategically it has surprised the United States military and everything that it's done?
Controlling the airspace around the president of the United States is incredibly complex. When you do it in an environment such as Turkey, that its southern border is Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and to the north is the Black Sea with the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and Ukraine. So you have two wars around you, and you have intelligence operatives from any number of those countries operating within Turkey. I would have to believe that this threat was both credible and exigent, and that this decision had to be made by the Secret Service and the United States military. It's important to realize that the Secret Service doesn't make these decisions in a vacuum. The President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the United States military. So the military and the Department of Defense has a large say in keeping him safe as well. To do something this extraordinary, well, I don't believe it's as extraordinary as people think. It's a matter of knowledge. The Iranians did not know which aircraft he was on any more than the press did, which was precisely the point. These same sorts of methodologies were used to bring Biden in and out of Ukraine on a train. I don't want to give sources and methods, but there were methods used in that case to move a president of the United States into a war zone that would be considered just as compelling.
Yeah, so we hear you. This is likely not unprecedented, and I hear you there. What I do want to get more to the point, though, is what should, the Secret Service or anyone else trying to protect a leader here be looking out for? Because you say this operation was fascinating in the way it was carried out, and it shows that the protective service is creative and adaptive. But I have a hard time buying that. President Trump was in Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally. This is not Kabul. This is not anywhere close to those theaters. I'm wondering from you, what does that tell us about how the threats have evolved in the last few years?
Well, the threats had certainly evolved, but I will absolutely push back on just geography alone. As I said, Turkey has an enormous border with Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet to its north. So it's very much like Kabul. It's not downtown Kabul, and it's not Afghanistan, but when considering that the war in Iran is primarily an airborne war, that airspace becomes critical. The largest security question I have here is not the means and methods. It's who or why was it leaked? The threat to the President of the United States and the press as well that day in Turkey remained on the ground there a month ago. But the threat or the insider that felt it was compelling to share this still travels with the president.
I hear you, and you make some very good points. What I'm saying, though, is that would that threat assessment not have been made before he went to this NATO summit? And again, I stress, it is a NATO summit. Should any kind of protective service not be able to protect a president inside of a NATO allied country?
I think that's a rather naive question, given the nature of the region and the threat and the wars that are going on in the world right now. The Secret Service and the military can do its best in a NATO country. Ma'am, it's based on intelligence that is available,
Paul, you
and it was an exigent and emerging threat.
we're just trying to, kind of talk to you about your knowledge, and I'm really trying to get information from you as much as you can tell us about the nature of this threat, because, many of us have traveled with presidents and prime ministers to war zones, and we understand that a lot goes into trying to keep them safe. But in this instance, this seems kind of elaborate. Are you saying that the threat has not evolved then? That these are just kinds of the things that go on when you're trying to keep a president safe in a country like this?
I do believe that the threat environment throughout the world has evolved, whether that's online radicalization, whether it's various attacks. It would be naive on my part to think that it has not evolved, given the essentially 5 assassination attempts within the last 2 years on this president. But the threat certainly emerged through an intelligence stream in an exigent fashion. I'm sure that they knew what the intelligence was when they traveled there, but that may have evolved up to the very minute of his departure. And they had to do what they felt to keep the president of the United States safe.
Paul, we really appreciate your insights on this because, again, it can be threatening to look at a situation like this and think that the U.S. president is not safe making that kind of a trip. We'll continue to learn more about this, and I hear you. You're saying we should not be able to learn more about this, that it's not entirely necessary and can be dangerous. Paul Eckloff for us. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Have a good night.